I want to kind of shift a little bit now to just understanding what the product role means in games. When I first moved into the gaming industry, coming in as a product manager, it was a bit odd because I felt like there was this push and pull between the production side of kind of the games company and also this growing product management side. And in the first episode with Rue, he kind of discussed how product managers were a thing and producers came afterwards. And in my context, personally, I noticed that kind of product managers was being introduced, but was not kind of the incumbent, and that was production. In your experience and just like through your career, how did you see the difference between product and production? And to a certain extent, I would argue you have to do both to be a great product manager in games. But how do you see this split?
Mm, yeah, oftentimes still, I do some mentoring work outside of my day job, and people will approach me for advice on being a producer in the games industry, and I have to say, I know it reads similarly, and there are some things I do that are related, but I'm not that person to teach you how to be great at being a producer. And then equally, producers themselves will quite often veer into, traditionally product management areas, especially in games where there's more of a history of the production role owning more of not just when things happen and who does it, but what the work is and why we're doing it. So, the split for me is what are we doing is an answer to, our strategy. The why, that's really the product manager bit. Why are we doing anything today? Why is this at the top of our backlog? Why am I asking you to, write an answer to this user story or this spec? And then on the production side, at least for me, the most comfortable partnership is the producer is then handling who on the team, how are we going to get that to done, and when will it be done? So, breaking it down that way. But certainly my experience in games has been all over the place, and I've been at loggerheads with people before and, made adjustments to deal with different team structures and projects. And, there's no standard operating procedure for a PM in games. Like you said, I think a lot of product management in games kind of filtered through once software as a service was an established thing, and then games as a service was coined, and suddenly the professionalization of long-standing games with constant updates that might be free to play. Suddenly, this role that's constantly thinking, the game's here and it's doing okay, but we want it to grow or hit certain targets. That person that owns that and thinks about that all the time and tries to provide evidence and a way to measure that, that's suddenly when people say, oh, they've got this thing called a product manager, um, you know, at Uber. Maybe we could have one too. And you see that in some of the studios and businesses and publishers that have come around. I always think of Zynga when I think of product
Hmm.
management in games, famously product led. Their structure has, PMs on a lot of teams driving a lot of outcomes, but it's not typical. There's lots of studios that will, potentially could benefit from a PM, but don't have one get on just fine. And then there are places that will have PMs that are doing quite different things. And I've certainly found that in my career when I discuss what I do and I discuss to my peers what they do. It's often a case of, you kind of compare like, oh, this is what you've been doing as a PM. This is what I've been doing as a PM. That's funny. I've never done that in my job before. That's pretty cool. I'd like to have a go at that. Or you've never, got to own the P&L. Oh, that makes your job very difficult. So yeah, it's something you work out. Ultimately, I think it's being the voice of the player and being able to measure the outcomes and being able to be the sort of profile that can affect change and be that person and drive it forward. So oftentimes in games, that means having a good understanding of game design, programming, technology, so that you can make the right case and get it done rather than, hey, this is the best thing we should do right now because of my prioritization exercise and all of this research. Sometimes that's not enough to get it through the pipeline out and actually into the hands of players.
I want to get to that voice of the player part, but I just want to add some context. One of the ways that I've been able to see, and I pretty much agree with everything you've said so far, um, is that gaming almost took the kind of production mode or the workforce structure of movies and cinema, because you had like this producer coming in. The producer would basically, like in cinema, producer would be anything. Like if you got like an actor to sign on a contract, you could be a producer for a show or a series. And kind of gaming took that, which I think worked because you had like these big titles that required these multiple different teams, and that's partially a big focus of the podcast is highlighting kind of the dynamic nature of just kind of a game studio, just building a game. Um, But kind of what I also found really interesting is that slowly, like you said, as software as a service became a thing, there's almost like this app store production model, or like the way you look at the kind of apps, and like you're trying to kind of increase those numbers and get those KPIs to go up to grow the business. And that kind of almost, it's almost like those two worlds. You have the Hollywood kind of production kind of type where you just kind of do everything and get things done. And then the kind of monitoring product analyst coming in and trying to take a bit of that pie as well. And like you said, that producers doing the when and the how long, and product managers doing the what and the why, I think is a really good way of breaking it down. Take me to, what did you mean by voice of the player? Like exactly, like what I've found in my experience is talking to players directly in social channels has been a godsend for me, at least for the
Hmm.
particular game that I work for.
Yeah.
Players are incredible in terms of the insight they give and the passion they have for the game, and they want to see these improvements. They understand what a game company can go through in terms of difficulty, and they're quite empathetic to the fact that yeah, we are
Hmm.
limited by technical problems, and there is a capacity that we can do at a certain time. But what is it for you to be the voice of the player? Just give. I'd love to for you to dive deeper into that.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's probably, the part of my career I've spent the most time learning and failing and focusing and refocusing and ignoring and then coming back to. There's a great talk I saw recently at Nordic Game from the game director of World of Warcraft, which said, over the last 5 years, we've gone from being designed by vision to meeting players' needs, meeting our players in the middle. And, embracing that doesn't come easily. Like you said, the almost cinema production style of this is my masterpiece and these technical experts will help me deliver it. And sure, the studio will help us work out if there's an audience and an appropriate budget for that. But that's quite different to, okay, is there a market need for this product? And if what we think is right proves to be wrong, are we willing to change? And how much are we willing to change? And for me as a PM and my own sort of way of being, like being very experiment driven, is I'm totally flexible. I'm almost welcoming trustworthy evidence that tells us what to do because as a PM, pretty much always working in live service in the games market, we're building it for players to enjoy like a hobby for as long as possible. It's for them. We sometimes forget, we say games as a service a lot, but we forget what that service part means. It means providing a service to players. So how can you understand that voice of the player? Like you said, you can speak to them. It's an underrated tool, I think, in games. There's a mythos or a history of being very close to our chests about what we're making because we don't want to say too much, and we can see some of the very public examples of where that can go wrong. But like you said, my experience at least is players are very forgiving of mistakes and not very forgiving of not delivering on their expectations or making decisions that steer the ship away from what they're enjoying. So yeah, doing player interviews, one of the first things that, most tech startups will do is they'll get a few customers, usually their friends, their family, and they'll speak to them, say, hey, what did you think of my ride sharing app? How was the experience? And they'll actually interview them. And, I've had the pleasure of being interviewed by people for their work and doing that sort of thing. And we do have user research and we do these sorts of things on games, but usually not until we've got almost the whole thing ready. Certainly PC console, it's a bit more free and easy on mobile. So yeah, speaking to your players, interviewing them, surveying them, play testing your game, these are all great. Scouring and aggregating data from social media for sentiment and feedback, all excellent stuff. Definitely a big advocate getting your community team involved in game production, not just bringing them on when you go live. And then yeah, how can we translate for games where we're hopefully talking about millions of players, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of players, that huge array of voices and opinions into evidence. So that is where metrics are useful because ultimately the output of all of these things are people's behavior. So trying to understand why they do things, trying to understand what some things tell us. So there are some commonalities that a lot of PMs will have worked around. If you see a drop in your first time user funnel, you are assuming there is some issue in the first time user funnel. Something is confusing, there's a bug, is boring, right? that is a good way of the voice of the player coming to us in a trustworthy way. You know, we see 100,000 people here, then 85,000 people here. In the last 10 seconds, why did 15,000 people stop playing? We can then go and try and speak to them. We can test around that, change things, do it the black box way. Okay, if we change this and that, how does it change? But these things ultimately, it's all coming back to not forgetting that we are making games for human beings, for people that think and feel and are irrational, right? And it's not always as clinical and clear cut as a result. So sometimes you do have to swim in the sea and get a bit mucky and trying to work out what the hell to do next. And, you know, put your hat in your cap and say, not really sure why you don't like this thing we made, but it's very clear that you don't. Can you please tell us? And then we will change it. That's sometimes quite a big barrier for a games team to jump over. It's not always something that comes easily. So trying to coach a team to get into that space, especially when you've got something that has traction, has players, it's a win-win. It's better sentiment and feeling around your game, and hopefully better performance because you are solving their needs, guiding them towards playing your game more and being willing to invest in it.
What happens when the answer isn't clear? And I know you could point to a lot of AAA companies kind of shutting down studios or making games that just don't resonate with their target audience that they initially kind of planned for. I sometimes point to the fact that maybe there's an over-reliance on data and not enough on, I want to say gut, but you have so many different sources of data around you, and also you have like your thoughts on kind of where the industry's heading, and kind of sometimes we look too much at trends and we don't really like many of the successful games had a visionary or a Hideo Kojima. I even think Druckmann for Last of Us to a certain extent. Like they're these game developers that follow their gut and just create something that's unique and resonates with players because they have an idea of what's fun for them. There's maybe they don't rely on data so much. I kind of throw it back to you then, which is it possible that with all these different sources that you mentioned, at the end of the day, you need one person or just a handful of people to say, we see everything. We can kind of assess and balance kind of what we feel is most relevant, but the decision at the end of the day has to kind of still come from us, still have to come from a place of art, of work. Um, how would you look at that with the just coming from the gut?
Mhm. You know, the way I like to think about it, because I'm a big, there will be PMs that will want to take down some of these personalities. I'm actually a lover of the sort of auteur approach because I think auteurs like Hideo Kojima, Shigeru Miyamoto, Neil Druckmann, right? What they are expert at, maybe intuitively, maybe from experience doing the same sort of games with the same crew for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, is that they understand that voice of the player. They have spent time honing that, and they might not be able to communicate it in metric terms, right? They might be put off by saying, we need to hit these performance metrics to hit our forecast. That might not speak to them, and it does mean sometimes very expensive misfires. But what they do know is they know their craft and they know their audience, and they know how to deliver on that vision, right? And it doesn't always work, like I said, but I think it's almost like the humanities version of a product manager, right? Like great film directors build a following and an audience, and they sort of understand how to speak to them with being able to take creative bets. Quentin Tarantino, right? If you're a fan of Tarantino films, you're kind of in for the Tarantino film regardless, but there will be good ones and bad ones. The interesting thing is, was that profitable for the studio to fund, which is why we're important, right, on the product side. So being able to partner with a person like that, being able to challenge them, being able to give them some guardrails, you know, yes, it's not about counting beans and telling you how to make the game. It's about saying this is how much runway we have. These are the outcomes we need to achieve. How can we give us as many turns at bat as possible? You know, does it really compromise the vision of a game? For example, Last of Us 2, fantastic, game, plenty controversial in places. Not sure if we can do spoilers, but there could be an argument to say, would it have been an issue to have, maybe had more options around how the game story worked based on feedback from lovers of Last of Us 1? Maybe that would have compromised the vision of the game. But again, the flip side is perhaps it could have reached and appealed to a great audience, been more financially successful. But you don't know unless you open that Pandora's box, and it does lead to clashes of culture and personality, and it's not always fun to resolve. But for me, um, I still like that. I still think there's a place for people with that, and equally on the product side, the more I do this job, maybe the more hubris I build up that needs taking down every 3 or 4 years. Like, wait a minute, there's still a lot you don't know. But um, I'm a big believer that the roadmap, the strategy for the game, the more that is plotting out other people's parts of a strategy, the less power and autonomy as a PM you really truly have to shape what a product is, what it isn't, and how it wins. So there is a little bit of that. It is funny, we're here in the UK. I'm from sort of background where I'm definitely sort of a left-leaning person, and I believe in the team of people, and let's all work it out, and we each have our roles to play. But especially on games, on products, there always seems to be a point where someone somewhere needs to make a decision, and if it's a single person with a clear vision that a team can buy around, product person, creative director, whoever it is, I think that does work. Whereas trying to work out the method for all the stakeholders to get what they need, that is complicated and fraught and expensive sometimes. So yeah, rambling answer. I like auteurs. I'm a big Kojima fan. I'm up for seeing, what he churns out. But I do think there's a value in underpinning that with financial expectations, performance expectations, sensible budgets for sensible bets, not just a blank check to, yeah, of course it will work because this person's track record.
And yeah, let's chat again soon. And if anyone has any advice, please just reach out, ask some comments. I think there's so much more to talk about on this, but thank you again.
Dude, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Really, really good fun. Great questions. Had a blast talking to you today.
Appreciate you, man.